wanted to do a quick overview of Native Alaskan culture, and just a little background about me. I lived in Mountain Village for 2 years, and so I definitely don't know everything, but living in Mountain Village kind of taught me how much I don't know about Native culture. So one thing that was pretty important to me is that we do tend to just say Alaska Natives, and they are divided into, you always see this map of the sort of the five families that are all different, and it's important to realize that these were nomadic people. So I mean that line, there wasn't like a border between the Yupik and Cupik and Athabascan. So I mean they intermingled, and a lot of times these are really purely geographical, as we'll talk about. And then just before we get started, I just sort of wanted to talk a little bit about just sort of the names and labels that we use, because it can be confusing. So an Eskimo is generally agreed to be someone of either Yupik or Inuit descent, but like the word Hollywood, it denotes a lifestyle as much as a physical residence. So if you look up Eskimo in the dictionary, it's kind of interesting. It's somebody who ice fishes and hunts for seals and lives in an Arctic place. So in a way, if you or I really wanted to, we could become almost like an Eskimo. If you're thinking of it in that way, you and I could not become Yupik or Inuit unless a family adopted you, because adoption is a big part of that culture. So I just wanted, and some people think of Eskimo as kind of a derogatory term. I don't know if anybody ever read Cheaper by the Dozen when they were a little kid, but whenever they would misbehave, the mom in Cheaper by the Dozen would be like, "Don't do that, that's Eskimo." But that's not really seen anymore, and most people, you'll run into people who will say it's offensive or be offended by it for somebody else, but generally it's okay as long as you're not just calling all Alaska Natives Eskimos, because they really aren't. And then next, I just wanted to say that the Inuit are a distinct subgroup. They're not a conglomeration of all Native Alaskans. It seems like they're kind of what you hear about, and that's probably because there's so many of them in Canada as well. So that just a clarification on that. And something that I found in my research that was pretty interesting is that natives from Kodiak Island are culturally, they're Yupik. They're not Aleut. So even though they're, if you looked on that map, that's what they would be. It's if you talk to them, they're culturally, they identify more with Yupik and Cupik. And another thing that I was just sort of told, I actually don't know how true this is, but I have talked to a few natives, and it's true of them, that even though technically Alaska is North America and they are natives of that land, they really don't consider themselves to be Native Americans. They consider themselves to be Alaskans first. And it's kind of funny, when I was in the village, if a kid was out of school for a couple of days and, "Oh, where were you?" "Oh, I was in America." And that means, of course, I was in Anchorage, because Anchorage is America. And that's just sort of their mindset, and it's not like a superiority thing or anything, but it's just them recognizing the very real cultural differences between the two places. So just to go through, I know I'm just sort of undoing everything that I just said, but just to sort of go through a quick overview of the five categorizations that you so often see. And these, I don't know how well you can even read them, but the population at contact and the population today, I don't want to talk too much about all the depressing stuff that has sort of happened to this people, and all of those things, because this is just supposed to be quick. But if you look at the numbers, the numbers kind of speak for themselves about, just sort of this cultural genocide that has happened pretty much to every single cultural category of natives. So I won't be talking much about it, but you can definitely do more research, and again, they just kind of speak for themselves. So just a little bit about communication for, and I apologize if I'm just totally mispronouncing Aleut and Aleutique. Children are taught if you don't have anything worthwhile to say about somebody, then don't say anything. And if you don't have anything to say, then don't just talk. The dispute resolution was just about community preservation more than justice. So taken care of by your family rather than the community. So that's just very the opposite of us. We live very privately in Western culture, and their living, their day-to-day, you know, going to bed, waking up, eating was very public, but their justice system and their reprimands were very private, whereas our justice system is very public. So social control was maintained partly by community gossip, ridicule, songs, joking, and ostracism. And literally the way that they would settle some disputes was by singing it out, like having basically like a rap off, which I just thought was super interesting. Athabaskan, this is sort of a big conglomeration in the Anchorage and Fairbanks area and beyond. I thought this was pretty interesting, and I apologize for the formatting. I did this on Mac, so hopefully you can read it. This is a pretty interesting because sort of we see a family unit as a woman and her husband, and they see a family unit as a brother and a sister, and like there's a lot of fostering between, you know, the sister raising the brother's kids and vice versa, and that's just sort of, that's the foundation of the family unit. It's not grandma and grandpa, it's mom and my uncle. And so, and often, you know, the brother-in-law and the brother are their best friends, and it's very interesting just to consider all the things that just make you have a different perspective coming from that. So for communication, one subgroup taught their children that their words would travel far and they should think carefully before speaking. And a lot of social avoidance to prevent confrontation or disharmony among closely related people, which I think that sounds terrible. I mean, we hate that you would avoid a problem. You know, you should never do that. You should tackle it head on. That's sort of our Western culture. But if you think about, like, you know, when in the village, when your uncle is also your social studies teacher, and your aunt is also the person who checks out your groceries, like there's just so much investment there. There's not the same amount of room for fighting and for dispute. So if there was a dispute between two people, their families would simply move until the problem was less important. So again, that nomadic element coming into play. And these are the Inupiat. This was definitely, I think, generally the last point of contact. They have the latest, what am I trying to say? It just seems like the Aleutian people, they first started interacting with the Russians in the 1700s, whereas the Inupiat, they might have seen white people, but they really weren't incorporated and forced to change their lives until the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. So we're talking about hundreds of years of difference in interaction between cultures, and just, I don't know, it's just fascinating to me to think about that, to think about, you know, how recently all this is, and, you know, what a blink of an eye we are to them. So for the communication, direct requests were considered rude, as were direct refusals. Speaking about a person who's not present, considered a violation of privacy. So if you can think about how a parent-teacher conference would go, thinking about that. People also have the right to act without informing others of their plans in advance. So if you and I make a plan to go see a movie, and maybe I decide that, hey, I read this review and this movie is just not going to be that good and I have a lot to do, I don't really have to tell you, and you don't get to be mad at me, because that would be sort of that's seen as a violation of my privacy and sort of my autonomy even. So just very interesting, I think. In the past, some Inupiat cultures had no stigma concerning divorce, remarriage, or polygamy. If you read Julie of the Wolves, sort of that whole situation, or it wasn't, that just not a big deal. And it was acceptable for parents to have a favorite child who they loved just a little bit more. And again, these are all just constructions. These were true of some people, not so true of others. I know I don't need to tell you that, but just as we know, it's not black and white, and we're talking about a huge conglomeration of people, some of who were intermingling constantly, some of who never, some groups of which never really even knew of each other's existence. So it's hard to talk about them as a group. These are the Yupik people. That's the group that Mountain Village, where I was, affiliated with. So Yupiks usually say goodbye quickly. If you've ever noticed in our society how we start the goodbye voice, well, it's been really good talking to you, and like we don't want it to seem sudden. We ease into it, because it's almost like, even if there's somewhere we have to go right now, it's like we have to act like, we're reluctant to leave this fascinating conversation about the weather. So my students in Mountain Village, I just remember one time, one of my students came up to me when I was talking to my mother on the phone. It was like a Friday night. I had plans and everything, and she was like, "So, Ms. Purser, do you want to host a dance for us?" And I was just like thinking, well, no, I've got other things to do. I was like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I can't do that tonight." And she was like, "Okay, bye." And she left. And she wasn't mad. She got her information. She needs to go find somebody else so she can have the dance with her friends. It's not a dismissal at all. It's just goodbye. And I think it's kind of funny because if you notice on TV, they don't say goodbye anymore on the phone, just because of screen time. So I just think it's funny that everybody's acting Yupik on TV. Verbal irony and sarcasm is often misunderstood. Once again, that may have been true at one point. I can tell you that there are many Yupik teenagers who are happy to employ verbal irony and sarcasm a lot. Teaching is indirect, relying on storytelling, and that's definitely very true. Some of what I've found is, not a lot of lecturing, not a lot of let me tell you right now what you're going to do and not going to do. It's reliant on storytelling. Men and women live separately in the winter. Social ranking depended on the person's survival skills, so it doesn't matter who your father was. It doesn't matter, what your social standing is, or even really what things you have. You may have more wealth, but what really matters is, are you gonna be able to provide tomorrow? Do you have skills to be in that environment? Males and females were taught separately, but they were taught the same skills: hunting, sewing. The men would take the boys and teach them things, and the women would take the girls and teach them domestic things, and then they would just kind of switch. So I thought that was pretty cool. And one quick thing that I just wanted to mention, when I was in Mountain Village, there was this thing that the boys would do, and the girls actually. When you shot a moose, you were able to provide for a family. So you would have this dancing ceremony, and you would do the dance and sort of telling the story of catching this moose in front of all of the community, and that let everybody know that you could provide for a family. And it's the same thing for girls. If they wanted to do that, they could. And it was just really cool because it was kind of like a bar mitzvah, but instead of getting presents, the child would give presents to the whole village, anybody who showed up. So it was just super interesting, so many parallels you can draw to different child to adult transition ceremonies across the world. And one of my fellow teachers actually did it when he caught a moose, and the whole community, of course, loved seeing him dancing, and all in the Yupik regalia. It was just so great. And so this is such an interesting thing. I did not find one thing about this dancing ceremony anywhere in my research. I looked everywhere, and there are whole books about Yupik culture that I haven't read, so maybe it's somewhere, but I just think that's very telling. There's so much about these cultures that we just don't know. It's just not there, and the only way to find out is to ask them and to talk to them. So I just want to talk about that real quick. The next slide, next few, I'm going to butcher, but they're the Tlingit, the Haida, the Eyak, and the Tsimshian. These are in the southeast. So the Tlingit language is very tonal, not so much what you're saying, but how you're saying it, with 24 tones that we really, by about 10 months old, babies have sort of learned to prefer the sounds in their home language, and we just kind of stop hearing the differences. So most of us can't derive meaning from it because we just can't discriminate it. Not like Yupik, there are no words for hello or goodbye. It's just you begin a conversation with how are you. So the extended family lived in one big house, sharing everything, and all life, from plants to animals to humans, was believed to be of equal value. So actually the word Tlingit just means human, and they needed that word just to sort of distinguish us from the animals, and for them it's a pretty nuanced difference between a human and an animal. And then we have one last culture that we're going to talk about. This is the Gusuk. They've lived in Alaska for just a little while. Really interesting culture here. They're forced to wear this tight clothing. They all wear these really pointy shoes. It's kind of weird. They paint their faces in strange ways. They prepare for these elaborate mating rituals. So it's just pretty odd culture. The population at contact, that's us in the late 1700s. So I just wanted to put this up real quick just to say, like, obviously all of us don't act like this. We don't dress like this. It's very general. This represents our cultural ideal, like it or not, but that's not who we are all the time, and that's not who we've always been. And we all have different opinions on this woman who is supposed to be our cultural ideal, and whether she's good or bad, or whether she even exists. So I just wanted to say that real quick. And interestingly, maybe some of you know this, but the word Gusuk, which is the word that the Alaskan natives I knew would use for white people, comes from the Russian word cassock, which is the cowl that the monks wore. So the first white people they met were these Russian missionaries who wore these cassocks, and so they gutturalized it and call us the Gusuks. So having said that about how general and how black and white these attitudes and these sort of patterns that we like to think we see in native culture are, and some of these I really identify with, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I remember that. And some of these I'm just like wondering, where people got this. So just to quickly go over that, we in our culture, Western culture, there's this need to demonstrate learning. Like, I remember from a very early age, my family had this thing they would do when I was like 18 months old. They would ask me, or maybe I was like 2, and they would ask me, like, what's grandpa's name? And I would say Jesse. And what's grandma's name? And I would say, all their first names. And, that was, they just thought it was hilarious and so cute. And like, I was on display showing my learning. And that's not really so much what natives value, is they're valuing that, you're showing respect through silence. For us, I feel so strange saying for us. In the Western culture, speaking to many people gives you perspective to life. There's no need to talk to people that you're close to. There's that cliche of, I know you're my friend because we can just be quiet together. And if you ever see Jane Austen, like those Jane Austen films, if they've done it right, they don't seat the husband beside the wife. Actually, I remember in Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy had to sit together because you couldn't have a husband sitting beside their wife because you're not supposed to do that at a dinner party. You're supposed to talk to new people. That's what it's all about. Whereas for natives, you converse at length with those that you are close to, and the way that you show respect to a new person is to watch them. And that for me, I definitely did find true in the classroom. I remember my first year as a teacher, it was about October, so that honeymoon period was ending, and I was just thinking, I'm just not connecting with these children. They are just, these behaviors are hard, and I'm just such an outsider. And this guy came to talk to them about tobacco use, and he was just, they didn't know him. He just come from Bethel or something, and that classroom got so quiet. I think he brought stuff for them, like, I forget what, little gifts if they would answer questions or even ask questions, but he couldn't get them to say anything. It was and it was uncomfortable for him. But that's what they knew. And I just realized, like, wow, we've come so far. I remember when they were like that with me. And so that's just the way they show respect. And so I just think anyway. So the next one is values conversation, whereas natives are more likely to value observance as a way to get to know you, what you do, rather than what you say. We place, if you look at any movie, anywhere, you have a character who begins at one place and they fail a lot, and then there's this big failure toward the end, and then it's a happy ending. And so we place a lot of value in that. You keep trying and trying, and then maybe you'll get there. Whereas with some Native Alaska cultures, where it's important to listen and learn, and don't show off what you can do until you can actually do it. And that's definitely something that I saw, because I would go through so many erasers, because for them it was not okay to have a wrong answer and to show me. And that I felt like, that's why I'm here. I can correct. It's okay. I'm not going to give you a bad grade. It's not a test. Let's practice this. But they didn't want that. They wanted to know right then and there and to erase. And I think it was like 3 erasers for every pencil, and it was frustrating, but you had to understand where it was coming from. Puts best foot forward. You present a positive self-image and high hopes for the future. I think this is so true for women. And you can take from that what you want. But whereas in some Native cultures, it's really not okay to boast about your kids. And I remember reading memoirs of a geisha, where her mom took her in to see her teacher, and the first thing she said to the teacher was, "I want to thank you for teaching my daughter, because she is so stupid and isn't very good at learning." And that wasn't to say that her daughter actually was stupid. That was just the polite way to begin with a teacher. And sometimes that really reminded me in parent-teacher conferences. That really reminded me of the way that they would go about speaking about their kids. And it wasn't like they didn't love them. That was just, I was a professional. I was there to, hopefully improve their children. And they, they didn't feel the need to convince me of what an angel their child was. So it was really realism more than negativity. Non-natives, rapid communication, whereas in a lot of Native cultures, there's just more comfort in a pause. If the next time you're on the phone, just think about, when do you start to be uncomfortable when there's a pause? And it doesn't take long, whereas they're more okay with that. We already talked about the closure, and in some of the cultures, there was direct versus indirect. So yeah, that's just a quick overview of some things some people believe about some Native groups. So definitely not black and white.